Hello to all our listeners, and thank you for joining the second out of 3 episodes dedicated to the Book of Ruth. Let us briefly repeat the important points we discussed in the previous episode, which will accompany us later. Our story takes place in the land of Israel around 1100 BCE in a small village called Bethlehem, which belonged to the tribe of Judah. About 100 years later, a ruddy and beautiful-eyed boy named David will be born in Bethlehem. In those days, the society that lived in Israel was tribal and agricultural. Tribal society was a cluster of extended families that protected and defended each other and maintained mutual responsibility and solidarity. At the head of each tribe stood the elders, who led all the affairs of their people. In an agricultural society where a person's entire existence comes from the land on which he and his family sustain the land, is and was the most important economic asset he had. Around 1100 BCE, a severe famine struck Israel. As a result, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, slipped into heavy debts which he was unable to repay. Because of the famine, the families who lived in Bethlehem could not assist him, and Elimelech was forced to mortgage his land to a creditor who did not belong to the tribe of Judah. Having lost his land and all his possessions, Elimelech's family uprooted from Bethlehem and moved to an ancient land called Moab, located within the territory of present-day the Kingdom of Jordan. The small family lived in Moab for 10 years, and during those years, Naomi's 2 sons married 2 Moabite girls, Ruth and Orpah. Again, a heavy disaster befell the family. Elimelech and his sons passed away, leaving behind 3 poor and broken-hearted widows. Shortly after the disaster, Naomi decided to return to Bethlehem, but first she had to decide the fate of her 2 daughters-in-law. Naomi had the right to keep them under her authority, and she also had the right to release her ownership of them and allow them to return to their home and remarry. Naomi chose the second option, yet only after long words of persuasion, Orpah agreed to return to her father's house. But Ruth was a stubborn girl, and nothing convinced her to part from Naomi. The social and legal consequences of Ruth's stubbornness are at the center of our story. From the moment Naomi released her ownership of her 2 daughters-in-law, the legal and familial relationship between them ended. From now on, the connection between Ruth and Naomi was a bond of love, like between a mother and her daughter, but legally, this fact had no significance. The 2 women who deeply loved each other left Moab and arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of spring when the barley harvest was starting. Shortly thereafter, Ruth went out to glean barley in the field of Boaz. In the previous episode, we discussed at length the law called Gleaning's Corner and Forgotten Produce. We said that this was a social law that allowed the poor to enter the fields and gather agricultural produce in the area allocated to them. Following this law, Ruth went to glean in the field of Boaz, the wealthy farmer and the 3rd character in the book, who now takes center stage. At early noon, Boaz came to his field, and when he saw Ruth, he asked, "To whom does that young woman belong?" Boaz's question is understandable, as Bethlehem was a small village where everyone knew everyone, and it was only natural that Boaz immediately noticed the foreign girl. The overseer of the harvesters replied, quote, "She is a Moabite girl, the one who returned with Naomi from Moab. She had said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvester.' So she came and has stood since the morning until now, and this minute amount is all she was able to collect to take to her home." Now we can reveal that Boaz was a distant relative to Elimelech, and when he discovered the identity of Ruth, he warned the harvesters not to disturb or harm her and not to lay a hand on her. Boaz's warning is understandable in light of the reality of tribal society, which was a cluster of extended families based on mutual responsibility among its people. In practice, since Ruth did not belong to any family or tribe in the land of Israel, she was completely unprotected. To her vulnerable situation, we must also add Naomi's weakness, as she and her family had left Bethlehem for 10 years. Therefore, the framework of tribal mutual responsibility was not available to her anymore. The desperation of Naomi's situation can be learned from what she said to the people of Bethlehem who met her upon her return. Quote, "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? Mara in Hebrew means bitter. Or, as Naomi described herself, she returned to Bethlehem as a bitter woman with empty hands. The vulnerability of the two widows explains Boaz's warning to his harvesters not to harass the foreign girl. Then he turned to Ruth and spoke to her. A short quote. "Hear me well, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field, and do not leave here, but stay close to my maidens. I have been fully informed of all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and the land of your birth and went to a people you had not known before." Chapter 2, 8-12. Boaz called Ruth my daughter, and this nickname has great significance in our story. The expression my daughter or my son does not necessarily indicate a family relationship between parents and children. It can also be understood as an expression of patronage and affection of a person of senior status toward a young person of lower status. Naomi called Ruth my daughter each time she addressed her, and now Boaz used this heartwarming expression toward Ruth, hinting that a ray of light shone on the gloomy lives of the two women. At the noon break, he invited Ruth to join him and the reapers for a light meal, and even served her roasted grain. Roasted grain was a simple, carbohydrate-rich food that ancient harvesters ate at noontime. In his quiet, protective way, Boaz made sure that Ruth ate her fill and left some aside. He knew she would take the remainder to Naomi late that evening. After the meal was finished, Boaz ordered his workers, quote, "Let her glean even among the sheaves, do not embarrass her, and even deliberately pull out some for her from the heaps and leave them for her to glean. Do not rebuke her." So she gleaned in the field until evening, and she beat out what she had gleaned. It was about an ephah of barley. The practical implication of the order is that Boaz removed from Ruth the restrictions on where poor people were permitted to gather agricultural produce. From that point forward, the laws called gleaning, corner, and forgotten products no longer applied to her. Now Ruth was allowed to take as much as she could carry from Boaz's fields, including crops that had already been harvested and bundled. Ruth gathered an ephah of barley, which is approximately 24 liters of dry grain, or the equivalent of 1 bushel. This quantity would have been sufficient to provide ample nourishment for both her and Naomi for several weeks. When Naomi saw the great quantity of barley Ruth had brought home, she asked for the identity of the generous field owner who had extended his patronage to her. And when she heard his man's name, she declared, "The man is closely related to us. He is one of our redeeming kinsmen." Naomi revealed that Boaz was a relative of Elimelech and a redeemer, and the term redeemer has a profound legal meaning that henceforth plays an important role in our story. We said that the land was the most important economic asset of a man who lived in an agricultural society. But the land was also part of the tribe's territory. If one of the men of the tribe was forced to mortgage his land to a creditor who did not belong to his tribe, the area of his tribe was reduced. To prevent this situation, one of the relatives of this man had to pay off his debt and redeem the land from its bondage. The most important detail for our story is that the land was returned to the tribe's territory, but not to the man who lost it, but to the man who paid its debt. Naomi, who referred to Boaz as a redeemer, confirms the claim that Elimelech's land had been mortgaged to a creditor who did not belong to the tribe of Judah. The two women reached Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest in early spring. Throughout the 3 or 4 months of the harvest, Ruth went out to Boaz's fields, and their love sprouted and matured together with the stalk. After the harvest season ended, Naomi decided that it was time to reap another final harvest. "So," she said to Ruth, "My daughter, shall I not seek rest for you, that it goes well with you? Now Boaz, our relative, with whose maidens you have been, will be winnowing barley tonight on the threshing floor. Bathe and anoint yourself, don your finery, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he lies, go over, uncover his feet, and lie down. He will tell you what you are to do." Naomi's words provide us with an additional picture of ancient agriculture work, which was based on manual labor. In the evening, when the wind is light, the owner of the field would lift or winnow the wheat in the wind. The winnowing separates the grain from the chaff. The heavy wheat kernels would fall at his feet while the chaff would blow away in the wind, and this action was performed by Boaz that night. The most important thing that emerges from Naomi's words is her great concern for Ruth's fate and future. Naomi knew that if Ruth married Boaz, then the mutual responsibility that existed between the families belonging to the tribe would protect her beloved daughter-in-law. But Naomi had an additional goal, which was for Boaz to be the man who would pay Elimelech's debt and redeem his land. So, with careful words, the wise woman sent Ruth out to lie beside Boaz. With this act and with the exact words that Naomi instructed Ruth to say, both women's futures lay in the balance. At night, Boaz woke up startled from his sleep and asked, "Who are you?" And Ruth answered, "I am your handmaid, Ruth. Spread your robe over your handmaid, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "You are blessed by the Lord, my daughter. Now while it is true that I am a redeemer, there is also another redeemer closer than I. Stay the night, then in the morning. If he will redeem you, fine. Let him redeem. But if he does not want to redeem you, then I will redeem you. Lie down until morning." 3:8-12. Ruth insisted on calling Boaz a redeemer, so we can conclude that the issue Naomi wished to settle was the redemption of Elimelech's property. Boaz, who understood very well what Ruth meant, admitted that he was one of the potential redeemers of the land. Yet Boaz's answer creates the impression that Ruth asked him to redeem her, but unfortunately there was a closer redeemer than he. Quote, "Now while it is true that I am a redeemer, there is also another redeemer closer than I. If he will redeem you, fine. But if he does not want to redeem you, then I will redeem you." There is no doubt that a rare mistake penetrated the text and completely disrupted it. It is not possible that Boaz meant that another man would redeem Ruth, because this would put his love for her in a ridiculous light and opposition to the story's intent. Furthermore, from a legal point of view, Ruth's redemption was impossible, since the law of redemption was a tribal law based on mutual connections among the households that belonged to the same extended family. As we know, Ruth was not part of any family framework that was obligated to protect her. Finally, we must not forget that from a theological point of view, Ruth and Boaz were a link in the noble ancient ancestral dynasty of David. From that perspective, which we discussed at length in episode 12, from the 6th day of the creation, God decreed that she would marry Boaz. So the possibility that someone else besides him might redeem her is out of the question. Before the sun rose, Boaz held a private ceremony, perhaps a distant echo of a marriage proposal. Boaz asked Ruth to hold out her shawl, and he placed several sheaves into it, a gift to Naomi. The sheaves contained all the answers that Naomi had hoped to hear, from the day Ruth first went out to glean in his field, and the reality surpassed her expectations. When morning came, Boaz went to the city gate, where judgment was traditionally held in ancient times. There he waited for the arrival of the man who was a closer relative to Elimelech than he, and therefore this man preceded him in the order of redemption. This was the man Boaz referred to in the nightly conversation with Ruth. We do not know what this man's name was, since the text calls him Anonymous, and that's why we too will call him Anonymous. At any rate, after the elders of Bethlehem had gathered at the place of judgment, Boaz addressed Anonymous and revealed to him that Naomi was trying to sell or redeem Elimelech's land. Because he was the first redeemer, Boaz inquired whether he intended to perform the redemption. Anonymous immediately declared his willingness to pay the debt. Then Boaz, who had prepared himself for this possibility, pulled a small rabbit out of his hat. To the surprise of the elders, he added another requirement to the issue of redemption. Quote, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi and from Ruth the Moabite, wife of the deceased, you have bought it to perpetuate the name of the deceased on his inheritance." Until this moment, the elders thought that the topic under discussion was the redemption of Elimelech's mortgaged property. But at that point, Boaz connected the redemption of the land with the law of Levirate marriage. In other words, Boaz tied together two completely unrelated laws, creating one intact issue that could not be divided. Let us explain what he did. The principle underlying the law of redemption stated that the closest relative of the impoverished man had to pay his debts and redeem the land. As we said, the land did not return to the man who lost it, but became the property of the man who paid its debt. The most important thing is that the land had returned to be part of the territory of the tribe. The law of levirate marriage, which we discussed extensively in the previous series, was intended to achieve a completely different goal. Only if a man passed away before he and his wife had children, his brother was obligated to marry the widow. The eldest son born from this marriage was considered the firstborn son and heir of the deceased, thus formally ensuring his continuity. Another purpose of this law was to allow the widow, who remained under the authority of her deceased husband's family, to remarry, bear children, and rebuild her life. Although the redemption law and the levirate law were designed to solve two different problems, Boaz's sneaky tactic wove them into one. He demanded Anonymous to pay Elimelech's debt and marry Ruth through a levirate marriage. If Anonymous had been tempted to follow Boaz's request, he would have to pay Elimelech's debt, but the land would not become his. Under the law of levirate marriage, the land would return to Elimelech's family because the son was born to him, and Ruth was considered the son of Mahlon, Ruth's late husband. Boaz's legal scheme was unprecedented, and for this reason he brought the issue to judgment. If the elders had protested his intent, he would have to retract his demand for two reasons. Firstly, the law of redemption indeed applied to Anonymous because he was Elimelech's closest relative, but because he was not Mahlon's brother, the levirate law did not apply to him. No matter how we examine it, from a legal perspective, the implementation of the levirate law was unnecessary from the very beginning. Secondly, Ruth was a free woman, and a free woman does not need to be redeemed. Anonymous, who was a clever man, refused to fall into the trap Boaz set for him. Undoubtedly, if he had insisted only on redeeming the land without marrying Ruth, the elders would have decided in his favor. Apparently, he did not need the land or the atmosphere of the judgment favored Boaz, so he decided to withdraw from the redemption. When the way was cleared, Boaz rose and declared before the elders that he intended to fulfill what he had asked Anonymous to do. Quote, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. You are witnesses to this day." When the elders and villagers heard this festive declaration, they cheered in his honor and declared in unison, "We are witnesses! We are witnesses!" Ruth and Boaz married, and the love story that sprouted and ripened with the grain ended for the best. The foreign young woman who left her people and followed her heart to a strange land married a wealthy man who loved her deeply. Shortly after the wedding, Ruth gave birth to a son, thus ensuring her place and status in Boaz's home. Finally, she was protected and secure in the land of Israel. But the story did not yet reach its final happy ending. The connection of the law of redemption with the levirate law had legal ramifications for Naomi, and she also profited greatly. Boaz redeemed Elimelech's land, but the land returned to Elimelech's household because he married Ruth under the law of levirate marriage. Obed, their son, was legally considered Mahlon's firstborn and heir, and therefore Naomi's grandson. Almost certainly, Ruth was not Boaz's first wife, but his last. If Boaz had other children through another wife or wives, each one of them preceded Obed in the order of inheritance. The fact that Obed was considered Mahlon's son ensured that he would not begin life empty-handed, but would inherit the property of his legal father, which his biological father had redeemed. The final verse of the book returns us to its opening. As we recall, before Naomi returned to Bethlehem, she freed Ruth and Orpah from her authority. By that, their formal relationship was ended. Orpah returned to her father's home in the land of Moab, and we can only hope that fate was kind to her, and that she also married a kind man like Boaz. Simultaneously, Ruth's devotion to Naomi did not change the fact that the legal and familial relationship between them ended on that very day. Thanks to Boaz's act, the formal relationship between the two women was restored, because Obed was considered the firstborn son of Mahlon, Naomi's son. Thus, the connections between Naomi and Ruth, who deeply loved each other, that were severed at the beginning of the story, were restored at the end. Quote, "The women of Bethlehem said to Naomi, 'Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him.' And Obed was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Naomi clasped the infant in her embrace, and her deep sorrow was comforted." We will conclude the series dedicated to the Book of Ruth in the 3rd episode, focusing on the artistic way it was written. Yet, it can already be said that while everyone can enjoy this beautiful story, those who do not understand the structure of the tribal way of life and the laws upon which the story is based are reading a shallow story that lacks depth. Before we part, we ask you to recommend this unique podcast to your friends and relatives, and until our next meeting, goodbye and all the best.